Thank you, Keith. We'll have to see what the audience reaction is to the sneak preview, see if it's worth presenting to a wider audience. I want to say that it is enormously refreshing for me as a journalist to be associated with a project like this. In my line of work, being a foreign correspondent or as often as I can be a foreign-based correspondent for network television can, as you can imagine, be a challenging prospect in the current media environment in which we all live. And it is extraordinarily refreshing for me once a year, and sometimes more often than that, to find myself working with Keith and Kristin and the Stanley Foundation, who have really demonstrated an amazing commitment to keeping this kind of work alive in an environment in which that is often difficult and challenging. We've also had fabulous ongoing support from Joanne Wallace and Raul Ramirez of KQED Public Radio here in San Francisco. And this year we've added David Brown to the mix, and he has brought the very good people at KUT Austin on board as well. So it's really been a wonderful experience working on this project. And this project really set out to explode some myths about Brazil and also shed more light on a country that I think everybody here knows, sadly, is not covered by the US media or by European media, for that matter, to the degree that it deserves. It is not a place in which any of us on the panel had much background. I was the only member of the production team who I think had ever been there before, and I had spent 13 hours in Rio, a lovely 13 hours in Rio, a last-minute assignment. I was deployed there to cover a UN conference by one of my overseas clients, covered a UN conference for half a day, enjoyed a caipirinha, took a stroll across Ipanema Beach, and returned to the airport to clamber aboard the very same plane back to Washington that had taken me down there that morning. From that experience, a Brazil expert is definitely not made. But this project gave us a real opportunity to sink our teeth into a subject that is as enormous as Brazil is geographically vast. 186 million people, roughly, a country almost the size of the United States geographically, suffering as one government minister, Roberto Unguer, who is the Minister for Strategic Affairs in the Brazilian government. Yes, they have a Minister for Strategic Affairs. As he eloquently told us during one of our interviews, suffering from many of the same problems as the United States. An enormous gap between rich and poor, divisions along racial and class lines, but also an almost natural predisposition to be a leader, certainly in its own region, but now, as it emerges as one of the world's fastest growing developing nations, to be a leader on the world stage as well. As Keith said, in addition to working on the radio documentary, I've put 3 segments together for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, which will almost certainly be seen next week on the NewsHour. If you go to the NewsHour's website, newshour.org, we have a series of video reports specifically put together for the online NewsHour that are actually up right now. You can look at those at the moment. The 3 segments that we're putting together for the NewsHour explore over 3 nights Brazil's economic rise, the internal challenges the country faces, and our 3rd story mirrors part of the radio documentary that explores the issues facing young Brazilian musicians as they seek to project their art onto the international stage. We discovered through the production process that the bedrock of Brazil's growth and development is essentially twofold. First, an emergence from 3 decades of military rule and the successful embrace of democracy. The election of President Luiz Inácio da Silva, President Lula, back in 2002 was a watershed moment. A former shoeshine boy and metal worker with no formal education, leading the Brazilian Workers' Party to victory in a democratic election, taking the helm of the nation, and then in power, seeking a compromise in government that would deliver a new economic dispensation to the country without terrifying the existing power structures and creators of corporate wealth. in a different iteration, I spend a lot of time covering events in and for South Africa. And the same kind of intellectual challenges that the government of President Nelson Mandela faced when he assumed the helm in South Africa, seeking to govern from the left ideologically without terrifying the right ideologically, is very much the same kind of struggle that Lula has gone through. The second aspect to all of this is the immense desire for Brazilian product around the world. And as you know, Brazil has long been one of the world's principal exporters of commodities, but today that takes on a whole different meaning. Sure, Brazil is now the world's leading exporter of soybeans. They get turned into tofu that hungry Chinese consumers are munching every day. Sure, Brazil is one of the world's leading exporters of iron ore. It gets turned into skyscrapers in Shanghai. But jet aircraft? I certainly didn't know before I got involved in this project that Embraer Aviation is now the world's third largest aircraft producer after Boeing and Airbus. If anybody here has flown on JetBlue or a host of other US airlines, then the chances are you have flown on an aircraft that is embossed with the hallmark made in Brazil. And that is a very significant development that is making a substantial change to the way in which the country is perceived internationally, but also the way in which the country perceives itself. There are still enormous challenges for the country to overcome, and Kristin's going to talk about those in a few moments. But first, we did want to give you a sneak preview of one of the stories that will be airing next week on the NewsHour. It takes a look at Brazil's remarkable economic growth. And this excerpt, which runs, I think, about 4 minutes, kicks off in the soybean fields of Brazil, where it is now harvest time. Soy is at the forefront of Brazil's agricultural revolution. And as we go into the clip, I wanted to tell you there's an interesting historical reason for soy's prominence in Brazil, which we realized during the course of our research into this documentary. Brazil's soy industry exists thanks to the unlikely figure of President Richard Nixon. In 1973, on the, I believe I'm right in saying, 4th day of John Dean's testimony in the Watergate hearings, Richard Nixon announced an embargo on the export of US-grown soy in a bid to keep a lid on what the Nixon administration at the time feared were going to be rising food prices. Very familiar topic of conversation right now. And those canny Brazilians read the news from Washington and figured out that that was going to lead to opportunity in some of the agricultural lands that they had not yet fully developed. And so they started developing fresh agricultural lands and planting vast amounts of soy to make up for what they accurately predicted was going to be a shortfall in global supply because the US wouldn't be exporting. And the rest is history.